So we have 30 minutes for this discussion today. So essentially, what we're going to do is just orient you to the toolkit. I know some of you have already invited me to present to your clubs, which is great. I went back and I counted, and this is actually presentation number 75 on this particular toolkit. And so not only since we've launched it in January, have we sort of done what I would consider sort of our immediate district roadshow, where I've had the opportunity to sort of fly into some of your meetings, but because I'm also the zone chair for the DE, or what is the title, DEI resource chair for the zone. I think that's formally the title. I've actually on a number of other sort of national committees across Canada. So I've also presented this toolkit across Canada to Rotary clubs and some clubs in the States, because they're also part of our zone. But ironically, what's been happening as well, which we had hoped would happen, is through sharing it with some community partners. I've also had conversations with community organizations and some colleagues of mine at Dow who are now using the toolkit sort of as a starting point for this conversation around systemic racism and anti-Black racism. So it's actually, getting some traction in some areas and being used more broadly. So on that note, so before I jump into the presentation, I would just like to stop for a moment and just acknowledge that where I'm sitting right now, I'm presenting from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq people. Also acknowledge that the significant foundation that the infrastructure and culture of Black and African Nova Scotian communities have played in the building of this province and country. I'm personally and professionally committed to continue to work to collaborate, amplify, and connect with many communities that live and work here in Mi'kma'ki. We're all treaty people. So one of the things that we just wanted to sort of start this presentation with, and this is not a slide if I've presented to your club that you would have seen, but just in terms of this posing, like why Rotary and why now, just building on some of the points of some of the presenters that have gone before me, we are people of action, and that is actually one of our taglines. And so where we position ourselves to do such extraordinary things like eradicate disease, we can certainly be a force of reckoning around systemic racism. So that is why Rotary, and why now? Because society and humanity needs us to step up now and actually sort of activate that collective force that we have. In terms of what can you do, and this was sort of a slide that was at the end of the presentation before, but I thought it was important enough just to bring it forward. You can start the conversation just like we're doing today. You can listen and learn, and then articulate or sort of metabolize how you want to either personally act or collectively act as a club. One of the key points, and there's many dimensions of defining systemic racism, just in terms of the starting point. So one of the definitions that I surfaced, and when we were chatting with our task force, and I have a slide that actually has all the members of the task force listed. From a systemic racism perspective, you can see it's policies, practice that exists throughout a whole society. So it's really woven into the DNA of our societal sort of structures. Anti-Black racism is specifically actions and prejudice and attitudes that stereotype and discrimination towards Black communities and Black individuals. So because we chose systemic racism and anti-Black racism as our first focus, we thought it was important just to sort of a level set understanding to put these definitions in the front of the presentation. We also wanted to recognize that, we're all on this journey together. And part of being on this journey is sort of approaching it, with an open mind and open hearts, but also with a little bit of compassion, and that we're all in different places. And so this is part of a sort of a schematic just to conceptualize that, your Rotary peers, your community sort of neighbors, your friends, or your family might be in different places. And these are some of the behaviors that you actually might see as you're stepping into these conversations, where you're going from sort of, along that journey, becoming an anti-racist, from the fear zone going to the growth zone, where you're actually embracing sort of what meaningful change means to you, and also what it means inside of Rotary, and also more broadly in your community. So just to touch on sort of the task force a little bit in terms of our approach and our commitment. So in June of last year, the then district governor, lovely Louisa, sent out a call across the district for anybody who was interested in sitting on a task force. And specifically at that time, it was systemic racism focused on anti-Black racism, inspired and sort of driven by a commitment for change around the murder of George Floyd. So it was struck in June, which was essentially 9 months ago. It feels just like yesterday, actually. The group met very intensively in the beginning, essentially bi-weekly, and just to sort out what we needed to do and how we wanted to approach this work. There was, and you can see on the right-hand side what the representation of the task force still technically is. In terms of membership, there is from various clubs across Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. These were folks that were self-selected. There was no criteria. It was if you stepped forward and expressed an interest, then you were obviously invited in. By default, I became the coordinator largely because I'm an organized person, and I was the one that actually sent out the emails. So it just turned out that I tended to be the one that stepped into that role. But everybody on the task force equally contributed to the creation of the toolkit and creation of this space for us to begin to have these very meaningful conversations. We did decide that our work needed to be anchored in a commitment statement that was issued by the district. I do have that in a slide that's coming up in September. We also decided it was best to sort of release a number of sort of primer assets. So, building on Kristen's point around sort of making sure that we got the message out there in a number of different consumable ways. And we also determined as a group that the best approach was to create a high-level framework that actually then would anchor all of the subsequent assets and then the approach. So I do have a slide that actually speaks to that. So you can see that we have 12 members on our task force, and there's Ian, who's the current district governor, of course. Louisa and Doug Logan are also on there as well. So we certainly had very rich contributors on our task force. Just to reiterate, our first area of focus was, and this was intentional, anti-Black racism. So you'll see that when you actually open the toolkit, particularly the resource guide. It is oriented towards building awareness and change around anti-Black racism. And our second area of focus that we're going to activate in the spring is anti-Indigenous racism. And so when we're ready to sort of shift focus a little bit, not that our work around anti-Black racism is going to change. It's certainly not a one and done. We will sort of send out a district-wide invitation to anybody who would want to be part of the task force conversation at that point. So just to highlight the mission statement that I mentioned before that was issued, the task force crafted it, but Ian graciously distributed it or circulated it. So it was really important for us as a district to take a stand and actually make a statement about why this was important and how we were committed to change. And it also aligns with a statement that was issued by Rotary International President Holger Knack, where he's saying that there's no place in Rotary for racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, classism, or ageism. So we recognize that this is a time for us to be part of that societal shift and change. And how can we do that? Well, one of the ways that as a district we articulated that we could do that was to create this toolkit, but also to start to raise awareness around this issue. So as we're sort of, again, figuring out ways that we can sort of share the message in consumable ways and ways that actually were relevant and meant something to Rotarians, we applied systemic racism and applied the four-way test lens. And so when you apply that lens, because the four-way test, of course, is our Rotary sort of moral compass, you can see that it's not something that aligns with the way that we actually define what's fair and what's equitable. So when we had actually quite a positive response to this outset when we delivered it and issued it, but because Rotarians can relate to the four-way test, and when you apply sort of the systemic racism and the anti-Black racism lens to the 4-way test, you can see that there's not an alignment. So here's this strategic framework that I mentioned that we developed as a group, and this anchors all of our work. So essentially, there's a little bit of sequential inference in the 4 sections, but it doesn't preclude that you can't go right to action and actually start right away. But what we're suggesting is that you start first with some acknowledgement work, sort of understanding that and acknowledging that there is a systemic issue that needs to be, that's deep and has historic sort of roots that needs to sort of be recognized that it's an issue that needs to be addressed. You need to build awareness both of yourself individually, but also as a club. And the third piece is that you then need to sort of stop and reflect, again, both personally and then as a club, just in terms of perhaps where you are on the spectrum. And just as a point of reflection from, I'm from Halifax Harborside and I'm the local service chair. This work changed the way that I've thought about the way that we engage community. And what was important was that, historically, of course, we do good. And of course, we had organizations historically that we supported. This changed the way that I was thinking about, do we engage the community in the right way? Have we actually asked them what they needed from us? Have we engaged in a conversation where we're not assuming what they need? So this actually changed the tenor of the engagement, at least from my perspective as the local service chair, which then had a translated change in the way that we sort of engaged the community organization and actually showed up in the community to actually offer support and build partnerships. So for us, from a club perspective, it certainly had an effect on the way that I sort of thought about that space. In terms of action, once you sort of work through some of those first 3 stages, you can start to formulate an action plan for your club or what we're suggesting. But again, you don't have to wait until you go through all 3 before you start to do action. Different clubs are doing different things. Again, in our club, I know that we have a anti-racism committee, and they are very active and they have their own framework and they have a plan that they're moving forward in terms of speakers, also a book club. So it depends on your club, where you are and what you feel you need to do to be active parts of this change. So just in terms of the toolkit, we are hosting it on the district website. It's hosted, and thank you, Holly, because she was the muscle behind getting it up on the district website. So we actually have it behind the logo and also in front of the logo as hyperlinks underneath. And we did that deliberately because we want community to be able to access this information because we feel it's actually really important. And certainly very useful if anybody, organization wanted to activate these conversations in their community or in this organization. So in the toolkit, we also, you'll find a number of different assets. We also oriented towards the adult education kind of principle where there's multiple assets and multiple ways to consume the information. And so it may look like a lot, but we actually need more on more than less, because we wanted to give you as many tools as you possibly could use to actively start these conversations and see meaningful change in your clubs and in your communities. So there is the resource guide, which I'll pull up in a second. There is a discussion primer. That's a 1-page where you just sort of, if you wanted to distribute something to your club for an upcoming conversation, that would be a good resource. There's a what can you do right now infographic. There's part of this conversation and sort of activating change, of course, is coaching in terms of, because we might be at different places in the spectrum. And so, we have to recognize that maybe we're all a coach and that we play a role in helping us all move together collectively towards active change. There is discussion vocabulary, and there's a slide deck with that. And then there's 2 assessments, one individual and one for club. So just in terms of, I wonder if this is going to work if I pull up. Just want to run through the racism, or the resource guide just for a sec. So it's in PDF form, but as you can see, there is, can everybody see that?
We're still seeing your slide deck preview.
Okay, hold on for a sec then. I
Mm.
will stop share. Yeah, I thought I had this worked out, but obviously,
Okay.
there you go. How about that? Okay.
Yes.
So just in terms of our opening statement for the guide is oriented also towards our mission, our commitment statement as a district, because we felt it was really important to anchor the document in that commitment statement. And as you're going through the resource guide, you can see that it's organized in the same way that the framework is. So we have sections on acknowledgement, awareness, assessment, and action. Each of the sections has an opening statement that provides a little bit of context about what we mean by that word and why it's important. And then in each section, the acknowledgement section is a little bit different than the other ones because there's only 2 resources. Just we felt as a group that these were 2 really good examples of situations or scenarios where there was a deep systemic problem. There was critical thinking around the root cause and origin of that problem. There was a series of recommendations that were created around resolving that issue, and then sort of a call to action. So we felt that these 2 reports actually were good illustrations of that kind of effort. The other point that we just kind of want to make is that when we were doing this work as a task force, at one point, I think, and I know Trinda is on this call, and I think Ian is on this call as well, and I think Louisa perhaps as well. At one point, we certainly did this brainstorming of every single resource that we thought would make sense to actually sort of bring together. We had something like 425 resources. And so as a group, we decided to make something more consumable. So this is not meant to be a comprehensive resource guide. This is just meant to be a starting point. So as you're going through, there may be resources that you see that are missing. They're probably on our list. We just decided as a group to sort of narrow down the list just to make it as accessible as possible. So awareness, similar to acknowledgement, has its own contextual statement. You can see that we have listed a number of resources here. These are movies. All of these are hyperlinks. If there's an underline, it's a hyperlink to the actual resource. You see it goes all the way through. So there's books and movies, articles. And certainly there's some, more kind of documentary and podcast kind of thing, multimedia sort of example. So assessment has similar kind of I'm running through it really fast. But if anybody sort of just as a, not necessarily a plug, but if anybody hasn't had me present to their club and is interested, I can put my contact information in the chat, and I'm more than happy to schedule a time. Or if you wanted me to actually go through one of the tools in a little bit more detail, I'm more than happy to do that. But as you can see, sort of we took our time to try to make it as organized as possible for folks. So then in terms of assessment, these are organizations that have gone through and created sort of guidelines and tools around sort of assessment themselves. So there's not only do we have our own sort of assessment tools that we've developed for you, but here's our other examples of organizations that have done the same work. And then in terms of action, similarly organized, there's books and articles, and also just some like training videos in terms of like maybe how you actually might translate something into action and what it might actually look like inside of your organization or your company. Let's go back to the presentation, which is there. All right. So just in terms of, and I think, Alana, do we have 5 minutes left? Is that a?
Yes, you got a little bit more actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
so one of the things that we thought we would just stop and do and have we don't have time to sort of have breakout groups or a conversation about, but we would just encourage you just to sort of stop and reflect from a personal perspective, perhaps where you are. And you don't necessarily need to write anything down, but just in terms of the key reflections areas. So when you're sort of thinking about you personally, and we're calling it your autobiography, that you have a good understanding of my ethnic and racial background. And so your answers are yes, no, and unsure. The second question is, I feel I have a good understanding of the ethical and racial background of friends and family.
Sorry, Lorianne, we
Uh,
can't see that very well because it's still on your preview.
Okay, hold on.
The slide is just tiny.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Oh, my heavens.
Okay.
Technology, holy heavens.
It's all good.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, is that better? Okay.
Well, it's pretty small, but that's okay.
Okay, so I'll read them out. So you can just sort of make a note mentally. So the first question is, I have a good understanding of my ethnic and racial background. So you're yes, no, or unsure. I feel I have a good understanding of the ethnic and racial background of friends and family. Yes, no, or unsure. I feel racialized or observe someone close to me that's being racialized. So yes, no, or unsure. So in terms of assumptions, and this is an assessment that's one of the hyperlinks underneath the logo on the district website. So you could open it up and certainly circulate it across your club if this was an activity that you wanted to do to start these conversations at the club level. Assumptions, I feel I have a good grasp on my racial bias and assumptions. Second question, I feel this knowledge has not influenced how I have interacted with people in general. If I were faced with a situation where I discovered my assumptions were incorrect, I would change my behavior. All of these are yes, no, or unsure. And then the third section is action. I feel I have a good understanding of what anti-racism means. Yes, no, or unsure. I feel that engagement in anti-racism behavior is important. Yes, no, or unsure. And I believe that I engage in anti-racism behavior in my daily life. Yes, no, or unsure. So what we're suggesting, and this is really just a tool, it's not meant to be confrontational. It's not meant to create friction. It's just meant to sort of help start the conversation and build your own level of awareness, perhaps about where you are on the spectrum. If you have what we're suggesting, if you have more than 3 unsures or no, that might be an indication that perhaps you need to build some additional self-knowledge around anti-racism through education, member engagement, or equitable sort of more criteria within your club.